Here. So we're going to talk about wetlands of the world today, and I have some slides that are somewhat text heavy, but you will have the recording of them, and so I'm not going to read everything to you. And I wanted to talk about wetlands all over the world. So we're going to talk about the major classifications. So what you can see here is that there are five main classes of wetlands. And wetlands are really just areas that have some form of inundation for certain periods of the year. And I won't get into the classification, that's the topic of another day. But there are these five major types. And I'll say that in general, they're saturated for much of the year. And so it's a question when we're looking at these all of how much water is there, how long are they saturated, how much biodiversity is there, so how many different plants and animals are there, and how imperiled they are. In some parts of the world, we've lost up to 90% of our wetland species or sorry, our wetland ecosystems. And so we'll look at whether they're still intact all over the world, and if not, how gone they are. The good news is about this, because I know sometimes there's bad news in environmental realms, we can always have them come back and we can construct new wetlands anytime. So we'll look at the functions and values of each of them as well, and I'll give you some kind of fun facts about wetlands and about some of the organisms that are in there. So our first type in that sort of list of wetlands is marshes. And there are subtypes of marshes that are tidal and non-tidal. But from a broad brush, they are inundated pretty much all of the year. And they're characterized as having not trees. So swamps have trees, marshes don't. Marshes have emergent, which means that they're coming up out of the water as opposed to pondweed, which is, sitting in the water or even submerged stuff. And they get water from tides, if you're talking about a tidal marsh, or they get water. These are shorthand abbreviations for surface water and groundwater. So maybe a river can bring some water in and groundwater can discharge up into these marshes. They have a lot of different nutrients in there because the groundwater brings nutrients with them and with it, and the pH is neutral, which means that the marshes that are in the inland freshwater marshes have a large amount of plants and animals. So that is the kind of broad brush of marshes. Their functions are that they can recharge groundwater, which we can then use as a resource. We can put groundwater wells in and get water that's pretty high quality in a marsh, because these things also are able to attenuate nutrients and attenuate pollutants. So they can take the nutrients and the sediment out of water, making it more pure. So it's a great place to get water. They also are able to moderate surface water, which means that in times of high water, the rivers can overflow into a marsh and the marsh can absorb that water. In times of low water, marshes can actually expel water, add water to a river, and can mitigate the effects of both drought and flood. You can think of them like a sponge. And there's lots of microorganisms, of bacteria in there, but not the kind of bacteria that's bad for us. Bacteria that breaks down different types of decaying materials, so that releases even more nutrients and makes for a vast assemblage of plants, including this common cattail. Cattail is indicative of a marsh. It is not salt tolerant, so you wouldn't find it in a tidal marsh, but you would find it in a freshwater marsh. And these are beautiful. They're now being overtaken in many parts of this region being New England, really, by an invasive species called Phragmites. And Phragmites is very fast growing and it can outcompete the cattail. So it's sad if you drive around parts of Massachusetts, parts of New England, you can see the cattails being choked out of the marshes and replaced by they look very similar, but they're feathery types of seed parts, and they just go crazy and they can outcompete everything. So again, that's a generalized situation of marshes. When we're talking about tidal marshes, this is a little bit different than freshwater marshes in terms of the biodiversity. Tidal marshes have a low biodiversity of plants. They are characterized as having really just Spartina alterniflora and Spartina patens, salt marsh cordgrass. And these plants will grow from low tide to mean high tide, Spartina alterniflora, and then Spartina patens from mean high to high tide. So you have this environment that is really neat. It's one of the true monospecies ecosystems in the world, and it looks like a landscape architect came in and just planted these bands according to where the tide goes. The good thing about them is that as the water comes in from the tides or as rivers dump out into them, sediment will be entrained or held by the plant. And so the plants that are always growing has this mix of plant material and sediment, which means that you have this stuff that is like a brick. And so for that reason, tidal salt marshes are highly protected from a legal point of view, the Protection Act, because they're very good at protecting our coastlines from flooding, from storms, and from climate change related sea level rise. So the reason that there's not a lot of plants here is because you have at high tide, it becomes all the way saline, 35 parts per thousand salinity. The marsh gets inundated, but then at low tide, the water goes way out from the ocean, and now you have either groundwater or surface water in the form of rivers coming in and making it a completely freshwater environment. So it's really difficult for plants to tolerate such a wide range of salinity, which is why there's only these two species there. Nothing else can do what they do. So there you have this wide variety of animals that can take advantage of this marsh, but a very low diversity of plants. One of the animals that you may see in a salt marsh, a tidal marsh, is the great egret. Beautiful bird. If you've ever seen one take off, it is really kind of otherworldly to see such an enormous, enormous bird go away. It's different from a snowy egret, which we'll look at later. I started to talk about this, but the tidal salt marshes are very valuable to humans. When we're talking about these wetlands, it's important, I think, to talk about the value that they have to humans. And they can prevent coastline erosion. They can also take pollution out of the water that's coming from land. We mostly pollute on land, being terrestrial species. And the salt marsh is a zone where you can take the nutrients. Plants take up the nutrients, they will entrain the sediment. And so the water that goes into the ocean is then pretty pure. They're places where food and habitat can be found for any number of both aquatic, so fish, and also terrestrial organisms. And birds like to hang out there, including the rail. This is a really shy bird in salt marshes. Rail is also called the clapper, and they can really be heard. It's a clapping noise that they make, and you can hear them more often than you can see them because they are so shy. The kind of bad news here is that though they're highly protected in this country, there is, in a global sense, pressure to fill them in for coastal development. It's really easy to make land by dumping some sediment on top of a salt marsh. Here in Boston, you may know or may remember that 30% roughly of Boston is actual original land. We made almost 70% of Boston by filling in salt marshes so we can make land. And as soon as you put enough sediment there so that you have the land being higher than the tidal influence, wow, you have land. Boston, right? We have a whole back bay region. And why would you call a terrestrial region a bay? Well, because it was a big bay. So we are guilty here of filling in tidal salt marshes for coastal development, as are many coastal cities. And those that remain intact are threatened by pollution, especially where they're near urban areas. So they can take a lot of pollution, but you can overwhelm them with pollution, especially if it's sediment. Here's a tidal salt marsh in South Carolina. Again, if you have the travel bug, beautiful salt marsh here. There's a lot of salt marshes. South Carolina, they start to winnow out and they're replaced, as we'll see, with mangrove swamps. Mangrove swamps take over where salt marshes go away. So those are the tidal or salty marshes. There are four subtypes of non-tidal marshes. In general, those four types are the most common types of wetland in all of North America, United States up into Canada. And they are freshwater unless you get them around some saline lakes. And a marsh will really pop up anywhere you have a poorly drained area. They can also pop up in the culverts, drainage ditches around roads. So they are usually not a lot of water, not a huge amount of standing water, and they can dry out, especially in the summer. And so let's look at a couple of types of these cool non-tidal marshes in a minute. But what they also share is that they are unbelievably productive. I remember my chairman at Northeastern saying, a tidal marsh is 5 times more productive than a hayfield. And I would always say back, Peter, well, that presupposes people know how productive a hayfield is, but they're pretty productive. What productivity is the ability of the plants in that ecosystem to take carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere and turn it into plant material. And so they serve as valuable pathways by which we're taking carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere and turning it into ultimately sediment. The plants will start to decompose and decay, and wetlands are areas of constant plant accumulation. So these non-tidal marshes, again, as opposed to the salt marshes, have huge numbers of plants, and the plants will support a lot of bacteria in their root zones, and then also a lot of animals. And so they are highly, highly biodiverse. So those are the two metrics. They're very productive, take a lot of carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere, and they also have the ability to support a wide variety of plant and animal species. And as with the salt marshes, they are able to mitigate flood damage and then also to mitigate drought damage and to filter nutrients. A couple of organisms that are found in marshes in general, the mink, which is in the weasel family, and then pickerel weed, which we'll look at pictures of in a bit. They are gone frequently. Again, just like with salt marshes, the easiest way to make land is to dump a bunch of sediment into an area that's wet but almost dry. And then when we have agricultural, especially, but any sort of human ongoings, they can be filled in by nutrients and sediment. And we are doing a lot to try to protect them, including making new ones. That's the good news about these wetlands, that when we feel like they're not here anymore, it's very easy to make a wetland. It's just as easy to make a wetland as to destroy one in many, though not all cases. Instead of dumping sediment onto a marsh, you would just excavate an area until you're at groundwater. There you go. So prairie potholes. Prairie potholes, if you've ever been in the upper Midwest, you see a whole bunch of potholes. And they fill in with rain and they fill in with snowmelt in the spring. The smaller ones can act kind of like vernal pools, which we'll talk about, but the larger ones will have water year round. And it's really neat to see them. There's this concentric circle pattern that's somewhat similar to the vernal pools we'll see, in that in the middle, you have deeper water and you have floating aquatic plants, true aquatic plants that can't live when it's dry. They just die out. And then in the next ring, if you have these concentric circles, you have the cattails that we saw in the previous picture that occur in non-tidal marshes. And then upland, you can have more sedgy stuff. So, grassy looking things. So it's neat to see these concentric circles. Here's some pictures of, that Minnesota is known as the land of 10,000 lakes. So it said that nobody's tried to count them all, but there are lots and lots of prairie potholes here. And they extend over into both North and South Dakota. And what happened was glaciers scraping over the landscape would pluck out big pieces of the ground and leave this pockmarked surface that then the water would come in and fill the holes in. Here's a picture of a western grebe with its baby riding on its back. And this is an important place for migratory waterfowl. And you can see up to 50% of the North American migratory waterfowl, including that grebe, uses prairie potholes as they travel from north to south. These are great at absorbing rain, and that prevents flooding in the rivers and the regions nearby. And the Midwest is really a powerhouse in terms of wetland regions because of all of these prairie potholes. There's a picture that just shows a map of where you can find prairie potholes. You see Minnesota, down a little bit into Iowa, North and South Dakota, and it extends up into southern Canada, Manitoba, Saskatchewan, and Alberta. So lots of them. The problem is more that we have imperiled their water quality, because if you look, I'm going to go back one. If you look at that map, this is where we do a lot of agriculture, right? We have a lot of agricultural practices. And so when you have agricultural practices next to depressions, all of the agrochemicals, the rodenticides and pesticides and fertilizers and fungicides, all will go into the prairie potholes, and sometimes we fill them in for commercial development. So we have only about half of them that have not been drained. The ones that are still there have, you can see here, this is an agricultural land, and imagine the pesticides, again, the agrochemicals that are going into these prairie potholes. Some of them are, kind of filled in, or others are obviously imperiled by the chemicals that are put into them. A similar type of wetland that is found in the southern high plains, and I'll show you a map of this, are called playa lakes. And this is interesting. When the European explorers were going towards the west, they would send word back that, oh my gosh, there's so much water here, don't worry about it. There's small little lakes with great quality everywhere. But that depended on when you were traveling, because others were really negatively impacted. Some even perished because they expected to have lakes all across the whole trip. But if you went in the summer, then there was no water anywhere. So these only fill after the spring rainstorms, and then they go away. And a lot of them will have water that evaporates so much, leaving salts behind every progressive year, that they can actually become a saline kind of little lake. And it's a mystery about how these form. They think maybe it's sinkholes. So, something happened to dissolve a subterranean hole on Earth that filled with water, or because the high plains is a region of strong, consistent wind. If you're talking about energy, we always call the high plains the Saudi Arabia of wind energy. It could be that strong, consistent wind direction has excavated, you have this sort of swirling motion like potholes in a river that could have caused them. Here's a picture, and we've drained a lot of these for agriculture because it is a more dry region, or fill them in for agriculture. And that's not so cool, because as with the prairie potholes, these are really important habitats for all sorts of migratory birds and waterfowl, such as the red-winged blackbird, the teal, and the mallard duck. They're all found in these playa lakes. So, kind of already said this, they store water. They are, again, disproportionately representing a lot of animals and plants where they are left intact. And the biodiversity of the high plains really is largely represented in these playa lakes. And they recharge one of the main aquifers, the Ogallala Aquifer, that provides water for this whole region. This is used for irrigation because, again, you see places where we grow food, corn, wheat, grain, and then also bringing it for drinking water for these regions. And we're currently taxing Ogallala Aquifer at a rate that is unsustainable. We're taking water out of it for agriculture and drinking water faster than it's being replenished. So these lakes are important and we should keep them intact because they are serving to help us with our water quality. This is an enormous crane. The wingspan, more than 6 feet. Sandhill cranes, they are found in these lakes. We're trying to protect them because of the biodiversity that's there and because of their ability to provide irrigation water. We're trying to figure out how to plant native vegetation around the edges of them that can serve as a buffer so that when there's agriculture, the plants that are around the playa lakes can entrain the sediment again and can take more of the agrochemicals off of them because sediment from the agriculture will just fill them in. And some farmers are trying to return to dry farming techniques, but we historically have used them as lagoons to dump animal waste into them. And so these along the High Plains region, that picture I showed you, 25,000 playa lakes or so. And because of the agriculture, this picture is just really kind of stirring, at least to me, looking at the fact that these lakes are in heavy agricultural regions. And so just imagine the sediment and the agrochemicals that are imperiling them. My favorite type of wetland is a vernal pool. There's two types of vernal pools. One is found in the West Coast, and then there are vernal pools around here at the East Coast. And they have similar sort of characteristics, but there are some differences too. On the West Coast, they dry out in the summer, and they can be, the small ones will just dry out completely for most of the year. The larger ones can have small puddles year round. And sometimes you have multiple vernal pools that are connected by a little, it looks like a river, but it's called a vernal swale. And there's clay underneath that allows the water to stay there. These are really negatively impacted by climate change, by hotter, drier weather and climate out in mostly California. There's a picture of a vernal pool. And when they dry up, just like the concentric circles we talked about before, there's just beautiful concentric circles of wildflowers. So here's another picture of a vernal pool that is drying up. It is intermittently wet. So if you come here in late summer, you would never know that this is a vernal pool. You have to come at the right time of the year. For that reason, it's tough because if you're a developer and you want to develop on this region, if you have land here, you would send a wetland surveyor out in the end of summer and you would say, oh, there's no wetland here. But it is the case that in the spring, they fill up. And they fill up with things that can really only be found at in vernal pools. There are plants that are only found there. There are animals that are only found there that have adaptations that enable them to survive the dry period, such as cysts or water-resistant eggs or seeds with a strong coat. And birds can come through here. You'll see birds, strong recurring theme here. Look at this sad number. California's lost over 90% of their vernal pools. And it's often said about vernal pools, both in the East and the West, that they are smaller than the bulldozer that destroys them. Because we have lost so many, there are great efforts, as you can see, that are underway to try to make sure that the 8% that's left are that stay there. Eastern vernal pools, this is my favorite, is a class of little seasonally wet ponds, if you will. If you're walking in a forest in New England, you might see these ponds at some time of the year, and then you go back in summer and they're gone. This is the only place that amphibians can spawn. And so what happens is things like salamanders can live for 20 years. Can you believe it? Or frogs, really, really neat stuff. They will spend their whole life up in, I think, abandoned mouse burrows. Underground, they're terrestrial, underground, subterranean organisms. The first spring rain, sometimes there's a little bit of snow on the ground. The salamanders all come out and they walk down to their pool. They follow celestial cues and they do something called congressing. You can see some really cool videos on YouTube of congressing of salamanders. So what happens is the males come down first and they lay a sperm packet or spermatophore, it's called, and they lay these packets. Then they go back up. The females come out next, and the males try to court the females and bring them to the place where their spermatophores are. The interesting thing is there's almost like three sexes of these salamanders, because there's a third type, they're males, but what they do is they come out later, in between when the males and the females come out. So the males come out, lay their spermatophores while they're doing the wiggle dance and trying to impress the females to get the females to come and absorb their sperm packets. These later males come out and they lay sperm packets on top of pre-existing ones, and then they just go away. They don't have to do the wiggle dance and court the female. So the poor first males that come out that are going to all this effort to get the females to get their spermatophore is all for nothing, because the female gets fertilized by that late stage of males that just come, take the eggs, or sorry, put the spermatophore down and just go away. So frogs also use these. They don't have this characteristic, but they use these. There's really neat things like fairy shrimp, predaceous diving beetles that are there. And the cool thing about frogs, for example, is that they can figure out the oxygen and temperature levels in these vernal pools, and they will undergo their metamorphosis from the tadpole to the adult frog based on constant environmental cues, that this pool is getting too dry, this pool is getting too low in oxygen, so they can rapidly expedite their metamorphosis. You don't want to do that, because if you do that, then you're ending up to be a smaller frog. And so you're more susceptible to predation or freezing over the first winter. But it's better than being stuck as a tadpole and the pool drying up. So you want to stay there as long as possible, but you want to get out before it dries up if you're a tadpole. So there's a picture of the adorable little salamander amblystoma that is in these vernal pools. Next type of marsh is a wet meadow. Really, these just look like grassland. And if you went and sat down in the grassland, your butt would get wet. So it's a marsh, but it's a marsh that is really between a lake and a upland area, and they just look like grasslands. And most of the time there is some saturated soil there, and it's a mix of wildflowers and then sedges and grasses and rushes. This is a wet meadow that is bordering an open water lake. So it looks like that's dry grassland, but it's wet. It's exactly what it sounds like. They're good at collecting water, and that reduces flooding. They're good at, as with the other types of marshes, collecting excess nutrients and providing food for the animals that are there, including birds and mammals. It's a picture of a marsh fern, one of the most common ferns that's there, in addition to all the grasses that are there. And as with the other non-tidal marshes, they've been drained, they've been filled, they occur near farming where the agrochemicals imperil them, and we are trying to keep them. So on to the second of the types of wetlands. We're going to look at swamps. And again, the difference between swamps and marshes is that swamps have trees, so woody plants, and they can be really, really wet. There are also shrubs that can grow, woody shrubs, and lots and lots and lots of plants, lots and lots and lots of animals in these marshes. And the two subcategories are shrub swamps and forested swamps. Here's a forested swamp, and just looks like a forest, but you can see if you look at the ground, it's all wet. Skunk cabbage. Funny story about skunk cabbage. Skunk cabbage is one of the first plants that will sprout in a swamp, and it smells like decaying flesh. And I'll tell you, I took some of my students to the Punkapog Bog, which is in the Blue Hills, and I have learned repeatedly from the botany books of wetland that this is an edible plant, but who would want to eat it because it smells really kind of off-putting. So I still remember this student from Alaska, Talia, I said to the class, and I had my little daughter with me, she was 4 at the time. I said to the class, "This is an edible plant." I didn't think anyone would ever eat it, but Talia picked a piece, and my little daughter, looking up to Talia, also picked a piece, and they both crunched into it. And they both immediately broke out into these reddish patches all over them. And my daughter was screaming because she was 4, and Talia was saying, Professor Cole, this really hurts. And I was like, oh my God, oh my gosh, I'm killing my kid and a student. What do I do? And so they were drinking water, trying to eat Cheerios and trying to, make this pain, itching go away. And afterwards, I went to my office. It was before the days of the internet and smartphones. And I looked, and the fine print on this is that though these plants are indeed edible, you have to boil them for between 4 or 5 hours, or the oxalic acid crystals will cause an intense burning and itching in your mouth that can last for several hours. So it is an edible plant, but if you eat it, don't be like Talia and Hollis, and make sure that you boil it for 4 or 5 hours before you eat it. So another picture of a swamp headwater of a river. So this is as a river is just starting out. And this is a great ecosystem for protecting against floods, also protecting against droughts, for removing all sorts of pollutants and chemicals, and high productivity, high species diversity, lots of food for animals. And we actually harvest timber from these swamps. And here's a prothonotary warbler, which is found in southern swamps. There's a southern swamp also, very well inundated. And you see these trees have these flanges, which are kind of the flared out parts, but they also have buttresses, which I'll show you. We've lost a lot of them for due to improper timber harvesting, but then also draining them, clearing them, developing on them. Historically, they've been thought of as really scary no man's lands, people going out into the swamps. So those are forested swamps. We also have shrub swamps, which can, which again, as you get to South Carolina, they will take the place in the tidal regions of salt marshes. And now you have shrubs rather than actual trees. And they're also found kind of adjacent to more of the swamps. Here's a picture of a button bush. Button bush is a common ornamental plant. It's also called a honey plant. Shorebirds, ducks will eat these seeds, and the flowers you can see here, I think, look like a dandelion when it's in its later stage, but it's a little more robust. They look like pin cushions, or maybe a coronavirus. An example, mangrove swamps. Again, they take over where the salt marshes leave off. Halophytic salt-loving trees and shrubs are in here. Estuaries are places where the rivers dump out into the ocean. And these mangrove swamps will start along Florida, go along the Gulf Coast into Texas. There are 4 species, red, white, and black being the most common. This is a picture of a red mangrove, and they have these extensive root systems, and they are great at protecting the coast from erosion. They are also found in the Indian Ocean. They ring the Indian Ocean. And when I was watching the Sumatra tsunami disaster unfolding, as someone who teaches also about natural disasters, I thought about and this is in a class on tsunami and disasters, but I thought about the coastline, the shape of the coastlines in the Indian Ocean. And I thought about, based on that, where the tsunami would cause the most damage. And it was interesting because when the reports started coming back of death and destruction, it wasn't at all what I thought. And so I thought I lost my touch as a geologist. But then the wetland scientist in me kicked in and said, oh, where the places along the Indian Ocean are very wealthy, so wealthy that they are able to leave their mangroves intact and, deal with ecotourism and preservation, and also where the countries are so poor that they weren't able to cut down their mangrove swamps, the loss of life from these tsunami waves was actually pretty light. And in the middle income countries where they cut down the mangrove swamps for shrimp farming, there was no buffering against these waves, these tsunami waves, and you could also think of these as cyclone waves, so hurricane waves. The loss of life and the damage was really disproportionate to the size of the waves. So these are really, really good. This isn't hype. You're really good at protecting the coast from erosion, from tsunami waves, etc. So here's a picture of a black mangrove. And these are the ones that you tend to find in the United States. They have these straw-like projections. They're called pneumatophores. What they do, there's little holes on them, and they are able to suck oxygen out of the atmosphere and shunt the oxygen down into the roots of the mangrove plant. So mangroves, they're decompositional environment because you have the water from land coming into them from rivers and streams, and it gets dumped out into the offshore region after the decomposers, the bacteria, the worms, the barnacles, the oysters break down the organic material into usable nutrients. So mangroves are sort of this halfway house of usable nutrients for the offshore fish that are there. So you have a decompositional environment that will dump out into the shrimp and the fish that live farther in the deeper water. And this is also a warm, quiet water protected environment for larval fish. So they get to stay there when they're really small, and that protects them from predation of birds, pelicans, etc. The snowy egret is a denizen of the mangroves, and in the 20th century, we used these feathers of the snowy egret for hats, for women's hats, and for that reason, they were hunted, as you can see here, almost to extinction. But it's a really good success story with regard to preservation and conservation because they've come back and they are protected species. So I kind of already said this. They are nurseries for shrimp, recreational and commercially important fish that we eat. And they export organic matter out to the deep water. And so they provide really valuable nutrients for ecosystems that are offshore. They buffer shoreline erosion, as I said. We have lost 3.2% since the 50s. There's been a decline in the water quality, and we have efforts to protect them. So those are the shrub swamps. Forested swamps, kind of looked at these in a general sense before, and they are very wet all the time. They are very diverse. We'll go back to the whole buttresses and the flanges. They are very diverse, lots and lots of vegetation, lots and lots of plants, lots and lots of animals in this. This is one that dried out, which is not very often that these dry out. And there is a wetter one. They're called river swamps. They're found in the South especially, and they are deciduous trees. And they have these fluted or flaring trunks, which I'll show you pictures of. Here are the forested wetlands along the Mississippi River, and this is what they look like. And again, they have to have trees. They can also have shrubs, as you see in the foreground here. But these are cypress trees, classic southern swamp. Isn't this beautiful? Can't you just smell it? So hard to give a talk on wetlands without having be here and smell them. So they have these buttresses, which are the big, giant flared bases of the tree. And that is a way for them to get oxygen. It's also a way for them to stay standing, even though there's water here. So it's for structural support. There's another picture, and you can see the rings on the base of the these trees showing that water is usually a lot higher here. So this would be a summer picture of these trees. So they are good at attenuating flooding. They are good at flushing out nutrients. You see a common theme here with regard to a lot of these wetlands. They're good at taking out chemicals and sediment. And here's another picture of a tree in this National Wildlife Refuge. Here's Mississippi. So you're looking at this region where there's a lot of these trees. Some of the plants that are here, swamp chestnut oak and water tupelo. Beautiful, beautiful trees. They are up to 60% gone. And so there are efforts that are underway to protect them. And here is the beautiful pileated woodpecker, which is found in swamps and in other forests, but loves swamps, loves the cypress trees. So there's the swamps. Last couple of types are bogs, and we will look at northern bogs, which are spongy peat deposits. And these spongy peat deposits are areas that only receive water from precipitation. So they're called ambrotrophic. They only get water from precipitation, and they have just this sphagnum moss. I'll show you some pictures of sphagnum moss. And so the classic term for precipitation only wetland is called ambrotrophy. They are things that can be formed by terrestrialization. So an open water deposit or open water that slowly successes their succession to a bog, or they can be polutified, which means that there's a slope and water keeps running over it until a bog develops. There's not a lot of biodiversity here, and it's low productivity as well, because it's hard to live in a bog. It's very acidic, and there's not a lot of nutrients. And so the plants and animals that have to live here have to adapt to those communities. So here's a mud salamander that can sit on the sphagnum moss. I show you this more because you can see the sphagnum moss that's there, up to 70% water. So it sucks water like crazy, and it can create acidic conditions. Bogs are really, because the sphagnum moss can absorb so much water, they can prevent downstream flooding. There are plants that are only found here, such as the pitcher plant, such as the sundew, and they provide habitat to animals. There are croplands that are imperiling them. We can fill them in, we can drain them. If you go to Minnesota, there's huge amounts of bogs, but there's these cross-hatched drainage ditches so that we can drain them and we can use them for wild rice in the Minnesota region. We mine them for peat, for horticulture. They are good because they're thought to at times regulate global climate, maybe, although they also produce methane. And they can be destroyed quickly, but they take a long, long time to form. They're very slow growing. This is Carlisle Bog in Alaska. So you can see it's all sphagnum moss, and where it's a little bit higher, you have tamarack trees and some trees that are able to grow in the higher parts of the bog. The northern bogs, really short growing season. So they are low temperatures. There's not a lot of productivity that goes on. And again, a lot of acid in this region. Here's another plant. Love these plants, pitcher plants, Sarracenia. So what happens is there's not a lot of nutrients. So the way that the pitcher plant gets its nutrients is by having this pitcher, as you can see, and these are pretty robust, and the pitcher is filled with water. I've always stuck my nose right in there and tried to smell it. I don't smell decaying flesh, but it's said that it smells like decaying flesh. And so the flies and other flying insects, the spiders, will go in, but then there are these hairs that point downwards, these projections that point downwards. So the bugs, insects, arachnids will go in there, but then they can't get back out. And in the water, there's also digestive chemicals, enzymes, that will break the insects apart, and then the plant can use them as nutrients. It's really interesting that a lot of these plants also have developed this waxy coating that is similar to desert plants. And at first glance, you might wonder, why would there be this waxy coating on plants that is typically used to prevent water loss? But in that case, it's used to prevent grazing by insects. Another bog in Nova Scotia, and you can see these shrubby plants and open water a little bit here and there. So the next type of bog is a pocosin. It is the Indian word for swamp on a hill. And the difference here is that there's not any standing water here. They can be very small, less than an acre to thousands of acres. Super, super dense. It's impossible almost to get through these pocosins because there's trees, there's all sorts of shrubs, and you can't get through them very easily. Ambrotrophic as well, so they are acid soils, but they are able to really clean and purify water. Here's a picture of this just real dense vegetation, lots of different types of trees and shrubs. It's a fire dependent, even though it's a wetland, it's a fire dependent ecosystem, so that they need to burn. Some of these plants can't germinate their seeds unless the seed coating has been burned off. So it's a fire dependent ecosystem. So not a very friendly place, between it being watery, very thick vegetation, and fire dependent. And so they're a haven for species that are adapted to living in these types of bogs, Pocosin. The slow movement of water, because there's not a lot of standing water, means that you get super pure water from these Pocosins. So it helps to maintain the proper, just really pure water that we can then use. And we can also harvest timber here. A couple of pictures. Sweet Bay, the Magnolia virginiana plant is there. And then lots of bears. Bears are really cool organisms. Give you some fun facts about bears, because there's bears out here. Oh, maybe I can, now that the sun has gone down. Nope, it has not. There's a wetland right back there, but there's bears back behind me. Bears are very interesting organisms. Their closest relative is actually a seal. They're extraordinarily intelligent organisms, and they actually grieve deeply for members of their family. They have excellent sight, smell, and hearing. They're one of the only mammals that can see in color. They can run really fast. They run about 40 miles per hour, so don't try to outrun them. You're supposed to just sort of sideways walk away from them. And they live to be between 30 and 40 years old. And they're, just really neat organisms. And they frequent these Pocosins and other wetlands. Wetland back here, the swamp. We have a lot of Pocosins historically back through time that have been drained. There's only about 1,400 square miles that are remaining. They're threatened because we timber them, because there's agriculture next to them, and we harvest peat and timber out of them. There's another picture of Zenobia. This is a cool plant. It's also called honeycup. It's a semi-evergreen. It's really slow growing in the Pocosins. It's a hairless shrub, and it's named after the 3rd century queen of the Palmyrene Empire in Syria, Zenobia. Also, habitat for pitcher plants. This is a picture of the pitcher plant I showed you on before, but there's the flower. You know, the interesting thing about this flower is it looks like it's super delicate, but because of the waxy coating on it, it's very robust. If you were to touch it, it's very robust and rigid. And there is the flowering part, beautiful. So there's a Pocosin again. They are subjected to fire every so often. Last two types of wetlands are fens, and these also form sort of peat, though there's not a lot of sphagnum moss here. Lots of plants, lots of animals, lots of grasses, sedges, rushes, they all look the same. There's wildflowers as well, and they have this string and flark morphology. So you have low and high points and of parallel ridges. And the parallel ridges form perpendicular to water. So water will flow this way. And you have this, it's called string and flark morphology. And peat can build up. And they are very good, as with some of these other wetlands, at buffering against floods, buffering against droughts, and purifying water. And they're a great habitat for things like this showy lady slipper. This flower is actually really delicate, and they're rare, and they thrive in these fens. We historically, this is old, 50 to 70, we had a 8% decline because of draining them for fuel, for agriculture. They are very slow growing, so they're highly protected. In the high points, you can see this woody stuff. There's some more tamarack trees, spruce trees that are coming in to invade this fen. Looks similar to a wet meadow. And the low part, it looks like open water, and it's flowing. but they're not as acidic, so that they're more minerotrophic. So there's a greater assemblage of plants there. Last one is riparian systems. So riparian systems are the edges of rivers and sometimes the edges of lakes, and they are vital to the health of rivers. There's plants and wildlife that depend on this periodic flooding from the river. And in turn, the banks of rivers are stabilized by the trees and the shrubs that live in these riparian zones. Lots of trees. They are very good at recycling nutrients, at making sure that the water quality in the river is very clean. And it's bad for rivers to remove these riparian zones. Here's a picture of a beautifully healthy riparian zone. So this riparian zone on either side, kind of like a marsh, if you will, or a swamp, depending on whether there's trees, will filter out sediment, will filter out pollution, will stabilize the bank so you don't get a lot of erosion. And this is the edge of the rivers. The river's sort of more over here. And so there's a riparian zone, beautiful, healthy riparian zone along the edges of this river up in Alaska. This is a bad one. It's, they've tried. There's agriculture pretty much right up to the edge of this river. And there's bridges that are built over the riparian zone. But this is not a great riparian zone because it just doesn't have enough lateral, especially back here, lateral spread to do much to purify the water and attenuate the sediments. Another beautiful, this is the Adirondacks, beautiful, healthy riparian zone in a wetland. And there's a last one. So there you have it, the wetlands of the world. And I hope that this is something that gives you a better appreciation for the types of wetlands that are here. So I will stop my sharing and